Hi, everyone. My name's Claire Wardle. I'm a professor of communication at the Department of Communication at Cornell University. And I'm excited to talk to you today about how to build empowering and safe online spaces. So let's go through some of these. I've got some pictures because it often makes it more interesting to go through. But I'm going to start with the problem, which I think we all know, but I think it's a good place to start. Then I'm going to actually go back to some of my older research, which is almost 20 years old now, but I think still helps us think about these issues. And I'm going to end with some practical ideas for building strong communities. So the problem, we know this. Why are public spaces so toxic? We have lots of research and news articles about addressing rising toxicity. What should we do about rising toxicity? How do we deal with mis and disinformation? How do we deal with hate speech? How do we deal with harassment? And it's something that people are talking about. People are creating television shows about it as a catalyst for conversations. We have people attempting new types of regulation. We have conferences where we talk about this every day. But many of you are going to say, well, yeah, we've heard this so many times. The problem keeps getting worse. And certainly we have more research now than ever before. But I think there is a disconnect sometimes with the research that exists out there about online abuse and harassment. And there's a disconnect between the research and people who actually every day have to moderate and keep safe online communities. And so what my hope is to start a conversation around the ways we can bridge that gap between research and practice. I'm somebody who has a PhD. I spend lots of time with academics, but I also spent a long time running a nonprofit, spending time with fact checkers and journalists and community moderators. And so I really understand the challenge of doing this work every day. But I also understand the importance of having research so we can evaluate what works and what doesn't work. So we know quite a lot about the problem. And so I'm just going to go through some of these. These were actually written up recently in a piece in Harvard Business Review, but many of you probably recognize some of these, which is number one, members of online communities often don't leave after experiencing toxicity. Unfortunately, we've become quite tolerant of toxicity. And so unfortunately, as the amount of toxicity increases, it's not often the catalyst for making people leave. That is gendered. Women, particularly women of color, are more likely to say, that's it, I'm not accepting it. But overall, unfortunately, toxicity itself isn't a reason that people leave. Secondly, online toxic behaviors are not isolated incidents. Too often when we see something, we might give a warning and hope that will be the end. But what we see is that when toxic behavior is excused or action against the person is not serious enough, there's this kind of acceptance of, oh, okay, we can move the needle. Like the boundaries are changing here because, nothing happens if you do behave, if you do take actions or behave in a way that's not acceptable. Thirdly, toxicity stems from culture, not a few bad apples. So I also want us to think about this idea of it's not just a case of finally banning one or two people who are behaving in the worst ways. It's actually about starting and nourishing a culture where that kind of behavior is not acceptable. Because as I was just saying, if we keep accepting this kind of behavior, then the quality of the overall behavior drops. It's all about creating a positive culture. Number four, rivalries don't boost communities, they tear them apart. So I've sometimes spoken to content moderators who talk about, people were having a conversation about two sports teams, and I thought it would be fine because it was about sports, but it ended up becoming really, really serious. So I also want to remind us all that sometimes conversations can start in ways that seem okay. It seems like, well, this can't ever get toxic. But unfortunately, rivalries that might exist in communities can tear them apart. And this goes back to kind of algorithmic moderation too. Unfortunately, we have this sense of the content that gets boosted tends to be the content that is more sensational or is more divisive, more polarizing, when actually what you want to do is foster a community where you're showing that behavior that is supportive, behavior that brings people together, behavior that it's about humility and honesty and apologizing. That's really what you want to boost. And finally, self-moderation is not enough to keep toxicity at bay, because I often hear people say, well, you know, I spent quite a lot of time creating my community and now I think it's just functioning. You know, I think it's just going to be fine. And I've got a couple of good people in my community and they're keeping it all safe. And what I want to remind everyone is this has to be an ongoing process, and it has to be something where the community sees the people who have started this community or the people who are responsible for this community. They want to see you and they want to understand that you are still there. And this isn't a case of like, oh, I'm just gonna let the community look after itself. So self-moderation is often not enough. So I think many of you, if you have run communities, maybe know these kind of issues, but I think it's worth reminding us of those issues. And so what I really want to stress is that online toxicity is as old as the web itself. You know, there's lots of conversations about how we're seeing an increase in toxicity, how there's so much more hate speech now. And it's very difficult to study this. As a researcher, we have less access to the platforms than ever before. But I think it's easy to pretend that the old internet, particularly before the social media platforms, that everything was nice. And I think we have to remind ourselves that the anonymity that is baked into so many online communities has created problems really from the start. And so what I want us to stress, and I've deliberately chosen these three pictures, is to say it's about returning to what we know about what makes healthy offline communities. It's about putting faces where possible to names. It's about finding ways to create space where people can be seen and heard. And so returning to what we know work in offline communities is a really good way of thinking about keeping our online communities safe. So I just wanted to touch on some of this old research that I did. Back in 2008, it was research for the BBC because they wanted to understand what we call user-generated content. They said, we're getting lots of content from our audiences, but we don't know what's true or not. We don't know how to create safe forums. And we're really not sure how to manage all of this content that's coming from our audience. So as part of this research, I did surveys, I did focus groups, I did some ethnography, I spent time watching audiences because I was trying to understand really what was going on here in the dynamics of the BBC asking audiences what they thought and how were they handling that. And this was an example of a project from the western part of the UK in a town called Bristol. And a local radio station, BBC Bristol, decided to run a project on Flickr, which some of you in the audience who are a little bit older might remember, but it was a photo sharing website. And BBC Bristol asked people to upload photos of the city because there was a new mayor, a new person who was going to run the city who'd never been to the city before, amazingly. And so they assumed that people would upload photos of sunsets, photos of the cathedral, pictures of festivals. But actually what they got was pictures of dog poo, pictures of mattresses, pictures of garbage that hadn't been collected. Because the people of Bristol thought, well, hang on, this is actually going to be seen by somebody who can do something about it. And to be fair, the mayor of the city did look at these photos and she went and cleaned up the dog poo. She cleaned up the mattresses. She cleaned up the garbage. And so people said, oh, okay, somebody's actually listening. And they uploaded more pictures of dog poo and garbage. And she went and cleaned that up. And it was this beautiful moment of people actually thinking that they were being heard. And what they were asking for, they saw immediate civic response. And some of you might say, well, what's that got to do with moderating online communities? But this project has stuck with me for the last 15 years. Because when I went and talked to audiences and said, why did you upload to Flickr? And they said, because the BBC asks me all the time, what do I think? They've got message boards, they've got phone-ins, they've got, comments underneath their news articles, but nobody ever reads them. Nobody ever listens to them, and nothing ever changes. They ask us what we think, but actually, I'm not interested in opinions. I want to tell them about my experiences. And here, I wanted to share my experience of living on a street that was dirty, that was a street that no one was proud of. And as a result, something happened. And so the reason that this project has stayed with me is because again and again, it's just a reminder that people want to feel heard. It's not good enough to sound like we're interested in what people think if we don't follow up on it. Because lots of people said to me, oh, there's like a black hole of UGC. I submit something and nobody reads it. It just goes there to die. So people want to feel heard and they want to believe that it's worth their time to engage. And so the same lesson from that Flickr project applies to all of us that run online communities. And that second lesson was that people want to share and hear about experiences rather than people's opinions. And so what I've heard again and again over the last 15 years is people saying, I've got so much from my own experiences that would help other people, and I want to share them. And when I go online, I want to hear other people's experiences. I want to learn from other people. I don't just want to hear the loudest voices shouting their opinions. It's not opinions that I go online to hear, it's experiences. And some people do like commentary. They do like to read people's opinions about TV shows or the latest events in world news. But I think what's important to remember is many people go to online communities to share and hear about experiences rather than opinions. And so just to end, I just want to talk about some practical ideas for building strong communities. And the first one is that when you run an online community, you get to decide what kind of online community space you want. And I always like to think about, well, what are the offline community spaces that I like to spend time in? I mean, I do like spending time in pubs, but I also want to know when I walk into a pub and there's a football match playing, I know I'm going to experience that pub in a certain way. It's going to be loud. It's going to be boisterous. It's probably going to be fun, but I'm going to have less control and it's going to be harder for me to be heard and it's going to be harder for me to hear. That's a particular type of online community. Another online community, say it's my local park or it's my local library, that's a very different feel in terms of a community. I am maybe less likely to know everybody in the park, but I might know a small number of people there. I'm going to want to have a space where I'm heard. I'm going to want to listen to people, but I'm going to want it to be calm. I'm going to want to feel safe. So I often think it's very important to think about the kind of online community you're trying to create. And it's fine. There's no right or wrong answer here. But I think it's important that you go into building spaces knowing the kind of environment that you want to create. And ultimately, you then make the rules about what you will tolerate or not. But you can only make those rules when you have a really clear sense of the kind of community that you're trying to build. And once you know what kind of community you're trying to build, the most important thing is to encourage the community to feel invested in that online space and to take responsibility for keeping it a safe, helpful, supportive community. And that's, for me, the kind of communities that I want to create. But that's not me saying, this is the community I want to create. It needs to be with the people that have decided to come and spend time with you in your community, and you want them to feel ownership over their community. And so I often think about a beautiful garden that needs to be constantly tended. And if I ignore it, the weeds grow. If I ignore it, certain weeds die. I think about it as an ecosystem because I think about it as what do bees bring to the garden? Like what's the equivalent of that in an online community? What does it mean if I take away certain aspects of my online community? Like if I take away the bees, it's important to think about an online community like a living, breathing space. And the actions you take have different consequences on that community in the same way as it would have on a garden. And so the number one thing that's so important when trying to do this work is writing and using strong community guidelines. And there are many, many templates online for these kind of community guidelines. But you have to spend the time upfront defining and describing strong community guidelines so that when you take actions against people, they can see why you're taking those actions. Because going back to, it's up to you to decide what kind of community you want. The guidelines also really show that and allows you to take actions that people might not agree with, but you've made it clear upfront. And so one thing I would add to the guidelines I've added here is, number 2, no hate speech or discrimination. Being really specific and giving examples of this. There are many people who do not have a clear understanding what you might mean by hate speech. You're not drawing on international human rights law here. You're using the phrase hate speech, but you need to describe to people what you mean by that. Things like content relevance. What do you mean? Give an example of something that would be relevant and something that wouldn't be relevant. Things like source crediting. Make it clear what you mean by that. So it's very important that you have guidelines, but it's also very important that you give examples of the types of things that you're thinking about. And so as a content moderator trying to create thriving communities, you are going to sometimes have really tough decisions to make. But the clearer your guidelines have been, the easier it should be to follow through on those decisions. And you can use those guidelines as justification for why you've made the decisions that you've made. And one last thing to remember is we don't do this enough. And when I say we, I mean academics, journalists, fact checkers, community moderators. We are really bad at actually creating spaces to ask people, A, do you feel part of this community? And how can we improve this community? How can we improve the culture? What are the ideas? And going back to that example from Flickr, if you do something like this that makes the community really believe that you're listening and that you're acting, you will improve the quality of the conversations in your online spaces because people will feel heard. So it could be the equivalent of a Reddit AMA. It might be that you host a Zoom webinar. It might be that you just, you create a Google Doc. Again, you might want to be aware of how you moderate that, but where you ask people to share questions and concerns, but also maybe other people have suggestions and ways to answer those questions. But this is really about maybe, once every 3 months, once every 6 months, once every year, but something that shows that you're listening and that you're also taking actions based on what you're hearing from people. So obvious but important tips. Moderators need to turn up regularly and be seen. Moderators need to model and promote good content that is helpful, engaging, and relevant to the community. And moderators need to be transparent and explain decisions around content, whether that's removal, flagging, etc. And one thing I'll say is that these rules apply whether you're somebody who manages a Facebook community group, or you're somebody who manages comments on a news website, or you're somebody who manages comments on a local health government agency site. These kind of communities exist in many, many, many places, but it's rare to see really good and strong moderation practices unless it's, a really popular subreddit or it's a really popular Facebook group. But I would argue that if we want to improve the quality of conversation across the internet, we should be using these kind of strategies across many different interactive spaces that exist all over the internet. And if we did that and we were clear about what was acceptable and what wasn't, and we followed up when people acted in ways that weren't acceptable, and we all participated in ensuring that online culture improves, we're not going to solve everything, but we'd be in a much better place than we are today. So thank you very much for listening. And you can find me. Here's my email address and my Blue Sky account. Thank you very much.